Bahrain, has it become the forgotten Arab uprising? As the world focuses on Libya, Syria, Yemen, what's happening in this tiny Gulf kingdom? And why is there an absence of media coverage and criticism from the international community? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. International media is unwelcome in Bahrain. It's getting harder to report and follow a crackdown that's widespread and unrelenting. Our reporter, Charles Stratford, has just returned from there and has this exclusive report on schoolgirls being targeted for beatings and interrogations. Now, opposition groups say police have raided up to 15 mainly girls' schools.
Pictures of the Bahraini and Saudi kings in the streets of Manama, a show of unity almost 2 months after a joint operation to clear the Pearl roundabout of Shia-led pro-democracy protesters. Bahrain has made major efforts to keep the international media out, but Al Jazeera got in undercover and has found shocking evidence of just how brutal the crackdown is. HEBA is not her real name. She's 16 years old and says police took her and 3 other girls from their school late last month.
He hit and banged me against the wall to make me scream. Since we did not scream, we were beaten more and more, stronger and stronger. The beating was severe, but being afraid of what was coming next meant we were senseless to the pain. He pulled a hose out and started beating us. He hit me over the head. I started bleeding and fell down. He told the guards to keep me in the restroom.
She says the policeman demanded to know details about her family and if she had been to the Pearl roundabout protests. She claims they repeatedly threatened to rape her and made her watch a mock funeral involving other beaten girls.
The girl at the front was dressed in a funeral shroud and blindfolded with a green strap. They were beaten up and screaming. We were told that our turn would come. We were photographed carrying boards displaying our name and ID number. We were not in our school uniform. We were forced to wear abayas.
According to the opposition group al-Wafaq, police have raided up to 15 mainly girls' schools in recent weeks. Students as young as 12 have been interrogated and many detained. A Bahrain human rights organisation says at least 70 teachers have also been detained. Al Jazeera secretly filmed this girls' school in the village of Sar. A parent who refused to go on camera confirmed that the police took away a number of girls in late April. He said the authorities have since ordered all Sunni students to leave and that the students and teachers are petrified about another raid.
This is a really shocked situation we are facing. Why they are intervening schools while it is educational sectors.
I'm very afraid because they threatened us with being rearrested. We don't know when we can start our studies or if we have been expelled. We don't know where we're standing or what our future is.
Charles Stratford for Inside Story, Bahrain.
Well, government officials in Bahrain have, at the time of this recording, not responded to Al Jazeera's request for comment. This is clearly an important discussion which needs to be had, and here to help us do it are 3 guests. In Boston, Mansour al-Areedh, the chairman of the Gulf Council for Foreign Relations. In Dubai, Staci Haag, the director of the Gulf Office of the National Democratic Institute. And via broadband from Bahrain, Nabeel Rajab, president of Bahrain Centre for Human Rights. Welcome all of you to the programme. Thank you very much for being here with us. Nabeel, if I could just start with you to get more of an idea of what's actually happening there in Bahrain at the moment. Elaborate for us a little on the situation that Charles reported on.
You know, the girls group were one of the groups were targeted. As you know, doctors were targeted, nurses, teachers, unionists, human rights defenders, bloggers, journalists, lawyers. All of them were targeted because of their participation or because of their sympathy with the uprising or because they've sent messages through their phone, through their emails regarding the uprising, regarding the Pearl roundabout. And the girls, the group which took a big part or leading part in the uprising. They were ahead of the uprising. And that's why when the crackdown started, when the Bahraini invited the Saudis to come in. The first group to be targeted were the girls in the secondary school. And many of them were arrested. A lot of them were tortured systematically. A lot of the teachers were systematically tortured. We have cases of sexual assault, sexual abuse among them. I mean, boys students as well, but we have more girls who've been targeted and who've been arrested and who've been tortured systematically.
So we've been hearing from the opposition forces that 15 specific schools have been targeted. Also hearing that these were schools which were not taking part in pro-government rallies. Is that actually the case?
Many of these schools have not taken part. Many of those girls, many of those people today arrested or fired from their work, terminated from work on their school, they have not taken part. Now it is shifting, the government shifting it to target all people in their sectarian basis more than they have taken part in the uprising or not. Many of those people detained, including those people who were tortured to death. At least 2 people who were tortured to death, they have nothing to do with the uprising, they have nothing to do with the protest, they have nothing to do with the opposition. Just they're targeting everybody. But government of Bahrain is going too far, it's going crazy, and arresting people based on sectarian basis, demolishing their mosques, raiding their villages, targeting their houses, firing people, being behind them. I mean, in all means, in all bloody means, they are targeting people more than exceeded those people who did take part on the uprising.
OK, Mansour al-Areedh, if I could turn to you. You work for the Gulf Council that works closely with the GCC. Does the GCC condone such behaviour?
Well, listen, we need to distinguish clearly between human rights, reform process and Al Jazeera shield. It's important that we keep everything in context. First, Bahrain is not an uprising, it's a reform process. Bahrain is not Egypt. The GCC are monarchs and they will stay as monarchs. Even in the yesterday's GCC consultative summit in Riyadh, there is also a discussion of inviting in part of the GCC Morocco and Jordan because they're also monarchies. And therefore, it is very important, if we want to keep things in context, Bahrain is not an uprising, it's a reform process. That is an important element that we need to consider. Human rights, it's fine. This is a legal obligation that Bahrain has done. If there is any breach of human rights, that's a legal process and the law will take its course. Also, the government is going to have a report to look into these if there are any violations or any incidents. And after that report, we can look into that and we will be more than happy. This is how I see the process of human rights evolving.
Okay,
now,
can I just jump in there for a second? Let's just give Nabeel Rajab, you raised many points there. Let's just try and keep this a discussion. And Nabeel Rajab, if you could just respond to that first point that was raised. Mansour al-Areedh says this is not an uprising. What's your response to that?
Well, when you see more than half of the population in the street calling to change the government, calling for elected government, and part of it calling for the removal of the whole regime, when you see more than half that your population outside in the street, which is much more than the revolution of Egypt, which is much more than the revolution of Tunisia, which is much more even than the revolution in Iran, in terms of percentage of people came out in the street. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, according to all international news agencies, hundreds of thousands were outside in the street calling for a reform or calling for removal of the whole regime. What you call that? What is uprising according to you? Now you suppress people, putting people in jail, torturing them, killing them, suppressing them, silencing them. It does not mean it's not an uprising because you have the ability with your tank, with your machine guns, with your airplane to put them back at home. That does not mean it was not an uprising. This is just you are trying to hide the fact. The fact people don't want you anymore. People don't want this government anymore. People are fed up from a government who's been ruling for 42 years. And this is the fact you have to admit and you have to face. And better than elaborating in whether it's a monarch or what is an uprising or it's a revolution. It is an uprising. People came out in the street, want to change, want to see a change. But what you have done, you killed people. You killed a lot of people, much more in terms of percentage than people died in Tunisia, more than the people died in Syria and Egypt in terms of percentage. Today you have political prisoners, 2 political prisoners for every 1,000 citizens. You will not find anywhere in this world today that 2 political prisoners out of 1,000 citizens. You will not find hundreds of thousands of people being terminated from their work, being fired from their work in a school and university. People are being put in jail. People are tortured. People are targeted in their mosques. People are targeted in their living. What do you call this?
Okay, Staci Haag, regardless of what name, what label we put on events in Bahrain, the protests, would you suggest that the majority of people there are indeed hungry for change?
I think so, and I think it's important to note that when you talk about things like empowering the parliament, about giving people more rights, those are pieces that everybody agreed on, I think, across the ideological spectrum from the very beginning. The challenge has become, because the initial this started, I would argue, as a reform movement that has turned into something more. But in the middle, in the moderate middle on both sides, you still have people calling for a constitutional monarchy. That's what the political societies continue to call for. So the question is, I think, how do you get out of this? Because the situation between all sides, the moderates are excluded from a process, and nobody is talking to each other in Bahrain right now because there is such a lack of trust among everyone. And that initiated, I think, with the first crackdown in February and continues on to the events since March 15th, 16th.
Mr. Al-Areedh, the GCC, everybody knows, sent Saudi troops into Bahrain. It seems that talking would be perhaps a better way to find a peaceful outcome to this situation. Do you suggest that the GCC is going to implement these talks?
Oh, thank you. Some points that your guest, the lady, pointed out, I would like to elaborate on. One, the stalemate now is true, but the next step would be, as you are aware, the state of national state of emergency was declared around 15th of March, and it will be lifted by on the 1st of June, basically 2 months and a half, the whole national state of emergency. The next step, which is very important for Bahrain, is basically to start a real dialogue. That is, I think, is where we need to go, and there where we need the help and the assistance of the West, the GCC, to facilitate such a dialogue, a real dialogue. And that dialogue takes in consideration, you see, it has to have some basis for it. One, that Bahrain is a reform process. Bahrain is part of the GCC fabric. We also recognize the opposition. And also the opposition needs to understand that it is not only that the Shiites are one part of the whole Bahraini fabric. There are the Sunnites, there are other elements that also need to be part of that dialogue. I think this is what needs to be done as a next logical step, and sooner rather than later.
Okay, Nabeel Rajab, another point that Mansour al-Areedh raised there was that the state of emergency will be lifted on June the 1st. Do you expect the situation there, Nabeel, to get any better after that?
Well, first of all, he was talking about dialogue. I think dialogue is a good step if it started, but then whom you're going to have a dialogue with? If all the opposition, leader of opposition are in jail today behind bars, and how come you start a dialogue? And now the government have been involved in a bloody crackdown, where gap is getting wider and wider between the ruling elite and the people. You have to face this situation, which is much complicated than 2 months ago. The gap is bigger and wider than 3 months ago, but still, I think we as human rights defenders here, we will push for any kind of dialogue to start. Regarding your question, I don't think this is the martial law lifting anything to do with an internal politics rather than it is for an economical interest. As you know, they are looking desperately to have the Formula One before the end of the year. And as Formula One is an indicator that Bahrain life has come back to normal, and Bahrain is desperately trying to tell the international community, the international economic community, that Bahrain is back to normal, and they know that Formula One start here means okay. So that's why they have lifted the martial law a few days before the decision that should be taken by the people of the Formula One. I think it's morely to do with economical issue more than with inside politics, and I don't think anything will change. And we're going to see after 1 month, I don't think much things will change with the removal of the martial law.
OK, well, let's look a little bit more about the international community. The US administration has been noticeable in its absence regarding the situation in Bahrain. We've had the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton urging a return to a process that would result in real, meaningful changes for the people there. And she said, quote, "We've been very clear from the beginning that we do not want to see any violence. We deplore it. We think it's absolutely unacceptable." Now, one opposition MP actually questioned Clinton during this seminar, which was aired on Bahraini TV. It was over the US's alliance with Bahrain. Ibrahim Mattar then spoke to us at Al Jazeera.
I think we would like to have a stronger relation with the United States. We would like to see our relation with the United States as opportunity for the progress of democracy here in Bahrain. We don't like to see the relation with the United States as obstacle. We don't want to see the Fifth Fleet here in Bahrain as obstacle. We would like to see the impact of our relation with the United States on our freedom, on our democracy and the progress here in the country.
Well, Mattar was kidnapped the night after that interview. Other detainees who've since been released say he's being tortured during questioning. So, clear question here. Staci Haag, why is the US not doing more?
I don't know. I think that you cannot go to dialogue when, as Nabeel said, the opposition leader, the moderate opposition leaders are in jail. I honestly don't know. There needs to be much stronger statements encouraging, at the very least, you cannot call for a return to dialogue while people like Ibrahim Sharif, a moderate, secular Sunni businessman, and Mattar, a member of a moderate, pro-constitutional monarchy, are in prison because they need to be part of that dialogue process. And I can't answer as to why the language hasn't been stronger.
OK, well, Mansour, al-Areedh, perhaps you might have a suggestion as to why we've really not heard very much at all from the US in relation to how involved it's been in Egypt, in Libya, in Tunisia.
Well, listen, give it time and dialogue will start, reform process will start moving towards a reform process which is in line with how Bahrain should evolve. But we need to consider one important point here. You know, we said, of course, about the GCC dimension, we said about the monarchy. There's another element that needs to be considered. Bahrain is neighbors to two pillars of Islam. You have Saudi Arabia, a pillar of Islam, and you have also Iraq and Iran, another pillar of Islam. Now, these two are proxies in Bahrain. They need to coexist in such a reform process. This is the balancing act that Bahrain has been trying to do always. If we get this right, then Bahrain surely can be an important model for the whole GCC. Now, that means that a reform process, a political reform process, must carry with it a simultaneous religious process. That, in my point of view, is key, where the West generally does not look into that because it doesn't see that a religious process is part of the Constitution.
Okay, well, it's also a fair point, isn't it, that Bahrain
yes.
harbours the US's Fifth Fleet. I mean, everyone is fully aware of that point. Nabeel Rajab, I want to pick up on Mansour's point that he made, that these protests are being fuelled by outside influences. What do the protesters there, what does the protest movement think about that?
Well, first of all, we always say as Bahraini Human Rights Defense, this was an internal issue, should have been solved internally. This is an internal dispute, a political crisis, should have been solved internally between the ruling family and the opposition in Bahrain. Unfortunately, government of Bahrain have regionalized the internal issue by calling a regional power, by calling the Saudi to come to our country, which has complicated the matter, where we witness more violation, more people getting killed, more people being arrested and fired from their work in Bahrain. So we have a more complicated story now. We have more complicated story in Bahrain. At the same time, answering to your previous question to Mansour, from the other side, we see the silence of United States. We see the silence of the Western power, which is very disappointing, very upsetting for us as reformists, as Democrats, as a human rights defender, seeing how much United States are talking today on Libya, seeing how much United States are talking today in Syria, and see how much United States are silent. Not only here, not only by issuing public statements, but even in a Human Rights Council, when we try to do with other partner international organization, we try to do some work, and the American put obstacle. So we don't go ahead with our project in the Human Rights Council. Even there was a project by Switzerland to take Bahrain for hearing, and Yemen and Syria. The American insisted it has to be only Syria. Now you have a silence of the West. We were caught up in a situation where there is a problem between Iran from one side and Saudi from the other side and America. We are caught up in a situation where there is a Shia and Sunni. We don't want to be part of this problem. We don't want to be part of this regional problem. We have demand. We want elected government. We want a constitution written by the people. We want our human right to be respected. It's very clear, as simple as that. Don't regionalize my internal problem. Don't get me with the Saudis or with Iran. Let them have their problem solved outside our territory. It's totally wrong when Bahrain government decided to bring the Saudi troops to Bahrain. They have made it more complicated. As always, they don't know how to solve their problem. Let them solve their problem outside. We have an internal issue. We think it has to be solved internally. Bahrain shouldn't have called the other, and nobody should call anybody from outside.
Okay.
Nobody trusts the GCC.
Yep, let's just return to Mansour al-Areedh just to answer some of those points. We're hearing from the Bahrainis they don't want divisions, bringing Sunni Saudi troops into Bahrain, seeing billboards up in Bahrain of the Saudi and the Bahraini kings next to each other. Is that not just dividing further the country?
Thank you. There are 2 points that's raised. One about the Western contribution. I disagree with Nabeel Rajab. If you look at the EU motion, which included basically Bahrain, Yemen, and Syria, and that was harsh. It had the motion had reference to human rights, Bahrain's obligations to human rights, and there was also elements that relate to the reform process. They are facilitating, the West are facilitating, and I think one of the areas that we could also discuss is how the West can facilitate these reform process, because I think it's also the reform process and bringing the aspirations of the people of Bahrain or any other GCC country is also helpful for the monarchs themselves. So we're not saying that it's a process that is not welcomed. It is welcomed. You just need to align all the elements.
Okay,
now,
I'm just going to cut in there. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut in there because we have run out of time. I'd just like to give a final word to Staci. I'm just wondering how strong at this stage the Al Khalifa family are in Bahrain.
When I talk to the opposition, there's still a belief of faith that the Crown Prince is someone that they can negotiate, someone that they can have dialogue with. However, he is seen as largely disempowered and pushed aside by the people who have initiated this fairly harsh crackdown. So, in terms of who's in charge right now, it's clearly an element of the royal family that believes that you get to dialogue through violence, which isn't helpful. And the question, I think, right now, in terms of moving forward, is how do you re-engage the moderate center, which I believe makes up 80 to 90% of Bahraini society on both sides. So it's really a question of which side it is, if that makes sense.
Indeed, this is a discussion that needs to be had and needs to continue. I'm sure it will. Thanks very much to all our guests, Mansour al-Areedh, Staci Haag and Nabeel Rajab. And thank you too for joining us. Do send any of your suggestions to InsideStory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.